Bernie of Flaming Griffin are in conjunction sponsoring a workshop on the history of beads presented by the lovely Marjorie de Fairfield. Take it away.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to try and condense about 32,000 years worth of history into the next little bit, so please bear
Bernie of
with me.
Flaming Griffin are in conjunction.
My name is Marjorie de Fairfield, and I've been working with beads since I was about 10 years old. I sold my first piece of beaded jewelry at age 12. So I like beads. We're going to start with the oldest bead that was ever found. Was found about 30,000, well, it dates to about 30,000 years ago. And if I can do this correctly, I'm going to share my screen with you and we're going to jump right into the PowerPoint presentation because, it's beads and everything's better with pictures. And assuming I have hit the buttons correctly, you guys should be seeing my screen that says a brief history of beads and has my name. And yes, that spells Fairfield. So up here in the top left corner, where you can probably barely see, these are some stone beads that were dated to about 30,000 years ago. All of them are tails. Well, there's one head, but they're all animal parts, which I find absolutely cool. 30,000 years ago, they were only making, well, the only beads that we still have from that long ago are made out of stone. If we only go back to about 5,000 BC, we start getting some pottery and some metal beads. Glass was not actually invented until 3,500 BC, which on this timeline is about a third of the way over. It's going to be right in this area is about when glass was invented. Took a little bit of practice before we got glass going as a component, but you can see over here we start getting different colors. These older beads are all, like I said, pottery, metal, stone, and most of them are either completely natural shapes. These ones in here are what we would call hagstones modernly. Hagstones are naturally occurring phenomenon where the water wears away a section of the stone, leaving a hole. They're commonly found in both salt and fresh water, but honestly, once you get a hole in something, it's pretty easy to put on a string or a cord or a wire and call it an amulet. It's likely that they still used animal products that did not survive the test of time, specifically things like bone and seed pods and seeds and other things like that. As we move through history, though, and we get closer to 2000 BC, we start to see a lot more colors and shapes as the technology improved. Glass became more and more common as we approach 2000 BC. You can start to see these other colors in here. Glass was actually not classified as its own material at this point in history. It was considered the stone that flows, and it was mostly done into beads and jewelry by pouring it and making a goblet, like just a little glob of glass, and then cold working it just like as if it was stone to get it into the shape that you wanted. As we move forward, when we get from 2000 BC to 1 AD, we start to get some interesting shapes. One of the shapes that happens is melon beads. We also get, those start up in Iran and Syria. That would be this top portion up here is Iran. And this is right about, this is 1000 AD is when that happens. These are actually banded agate. Right at this period, they're still made out of stone. But by over here around 1 BC, these are the same patterns, but these are made out of glass. As the technology improved, it was getting easier and easier to shape glass. They started making the glass look more like stone. Also in this period, we start to get more interesting shapes. Over here in Greece, you can see that we start getting bottle shapes. These are little juglets, and these are about an inch to an inch and a half tall. There's some that are bigger and some that are littler, but this is about the period around 800 BC is when they started doing core formed vessels, which was a new glass technology. And instead of glass blowing hasn't been invented yet. So what they did to make a vessel is they would make a core out of dung and sand, and they would heat that up, coat it with broken glass, heat that up, coat it with broken glass, heat that up, coat it with broken glass until it all melted together, and you have this this vessel that formed around a solid core. Those kind of vessels take a lot of effort to build, and then once you've got them made, you get one of your apprentices or a random peon around to dig out all of that clay, that poo, all that stuff out of there. And then these were very expensive because they were so labor intensive. Usually they were relatively small, maybe 2 to 4 inches tall, and they were used to hold coal, like eyeliner. If you were super wealthy, you could get a cup out of one, but in this period, we're still looking at beads. Over here in Phoenicia, they're the ones that really started to take off on the whole, we're going to do fancy stuff. You can see they started doing head beads around 800 BC. And as they progressed, they just got fancier and fancier until they started doing crazy things like ram's heads beads. These guys with the beards, some of them, the beards are just, they're just applied glass, and some of them, each curl is created separately and then fused into the head. Also in this period, we have the New World over here. This is South America. We've got Ecuador did these turquoise beads. And Peru did this one down here that looks kind of like the earth. This is a frit bead. That's the system where they take broken glass and they roll the hot glass in it to get the varying colors on the front. And then this curved bead down here at the bottom, that one's from, I have to check my notes on that one. That one's from the Olmec, which is modern day Mexico. While we're down here, these are China's Warring States beads. Warring States is about 600 BC to about 200 BC, if I'm remembering correctly. And these guys pretty much mastered eye beads. I'll have some slides a little bit later that'll show you some close-ups of some of these, and you can just see the complexity. They're just dots of glass on glass, and you wouldn't think that would be super cool, but it gets really complicated really fast. Moving right through. Speaking of the fancy beads, this is one of those jug beads. This one's actually from the 3rd century BC. This is the Roman jug bead. You can see that they've added a handle to the basic form, and then they've added decorations. These same decorations could be made out of clay on the clay jugs that these are meant to emulate. This is a close-up of one of the Carthaginian head beads. And you can see on this, each one of those curls is manufactured separately, both the ones in his beard and the ones on his head, and then applied individually onto a still hot piece of glass. These are done using a lampwork technique, which is really pretty cool. You've got to keep the whole bead hot, but not so hot it gets squishy, because you need hot glass will only stick to hot glass. If it's too cold when you try to add the curls, you'll either break the curl or more likely you'll break the head bead and have to start over. Down here on the bottom, I've got, these are actually much later, but this is where they fit on the slides. These are the mosaic beads. These are from Ribe, and these are Viking era. You can see in here those checkerboards and the dots both used together. And these are applied separately. You can see the little checkerboards down here. And as they're heated and applied, they spread out, which is why they look so much bigger up here on the bead than they do down here when they're still just checkerboard glass. Once we've passed 1 AD, somewhere about 100 BC is when the glass blowing was invented, and that's when all the spectacular changes start. But once we hit 1 AD and we start moving into the future, this chart just can't hold everything. Up here at the top, we have primarily, this is going to be your northern states, northern European states. This right here, these 10 beads, that's the Viking beads. Over here, this is the Roman stuff. And again, you can see some of that banded agate and some dot beads. This is also when we start seeing like the more traditional evil eye beads. The eye beads have started before this, but this is when we start seeing what is now a modern design for the eye beads. We've also still got some New World beads over here. These are Costa Rican. And in 700, thereabouts, we start seeing this new shape. These are Korean claw beads. They're primarily made out of jade. A few of them have been found made out of clay. And I have heard about them being made out of glass, but I haven't actually seen one that was made out of glass yet. I'm still looking for that. At this point, stripes and squiggles start getting real popular. You can see them here in the Islamic beads. A lot of these are pretty simple patterns. Stripes that have been raked give you this lovely, you can see right here where it just gets pulled, the glass gets pulled while it's hot, and it makes these little feather patterns.
Marjorie, we had a comment. I don't know how to change your mouse cursor size. So could you maybe also give some audio hint about where you are on the page? It is difficult to see your mouse.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
I can try that. So if you look about midway in this graph, vertically, you can see both vertically and horizontally, you'll see a big red bead with this feather pattern on it. This is what I'm speaking of when I talk about it's, a lot of people have done this with icing. If you drizzle stripes on something and then you drag a knife through it, you get a feathering pattern. That's what they've done with these beads. Sorry, I lost my spot. I did mention that this is a brief history of beads. If you look at the top of this timeline, right here in the middle, there are 10 beads right where this page break is. That's all of the Viking beads that are established on this timeline that goes from 30,000 BC to the present. Johann Kalmer is like the guy that started classifying Viking beads. He classified over 600 types of Viking beads, and largely those were in family groups. The ones that you see here, that's 10 beads. So if you want to extrapolate from that, that these 10 beads represent 600 different varieties, you can tell how crammed packed this, this brief history is going to be. So the other kind of bead I wanted to bring up at this point is late in our period, around 1500, I'm in the top right-hand corner of this timeline. These beads that look super fancy with their zigzags up here, these are cane beads. These require glass blowing to be able to accomplish, and these are done with furnace glass rather than winding around a stick as most lampwork beads are done. These are made with furnace glass. What these are is they take a color of glass out of a furnace and they blow it into a star-shaped form, and then they dip it in another color of glass. That's how you get the red and then the white stripes over it. And they put them in progressively larger forms as they add layers of glass. When they've got the shape and colors layered the way that they want them to be layered, they take the glass and with the bubble in it, one guy grabs one end of the glass, one guy grabs the other end of the glass, and they pull it just as fast as they can to make a long cane. These canes can be up to 100 yards long. Usually they're 30 or 40 feet. And when the glass cools, they cut the cane into sections. These sections can range from a 1/4 inch to 2-inch sections of glass. Then they grind down the ends to make, instead of having just that cut tube, straw-shaped looking piece of glass, they grind down the ends so that you get the rounder shape. And as they do, the layers start to show. and you get these beautiful chevron patterns. These slides are better because I found these pictures online and we're not dealing with my camera skills. Up here in the top left again is the Venetian beads. Those overlapped a little bit. But as we move through the centuries here, this slide goes from 1500 to 1986, I think. And it leaves out a lot, but it gives you a good grasp of how much things are changing. Again, we're getting a lot of different variety in the shapes and a lot of different variety in the decorative patterns. In here, you can see about in the middle, about a third of the way from the left, there are a bunch of the agate style with the wiggly, squiggly lines, more imitation rock, basically. And in here, we also start to see the African beads. The African beads start around in the 1800s. And they start out primarily as either large clay beads or as metal beads, more like what we would consider brooches, big and bulky pieces. I believe this one is 3 or 4 inches across. I'd have to look it up to be certain. But these are the bigger, bulkier beads. And they don't start to get into the large variety until after 1900. Australia is not included on this timeline. I'm not entirely certain why. If it were, its bead pattern would also follow Africa's, except that Australian beads are going to start mostly being imported as trade beads. They get the different beads that were used as currency in the 18 and 19 and early 1900s. Those also started getting traded in Australia around this time. North American beads, they don't do a lot of their own bead manufacture, but they do a lot of work with beads. Primarily, we think of North American beads being seed bead work, seed beads, bugle beads, like Comanche weave and brick weave and that sort of thing. But they did do some of their own manufactured beads, primarily in turquoise and shells, the stones of the American Southwest, and along the coastal areas, they used the materials that they had. Australia also, so a little bit of anthropology here. For Australia Aboriginal beads, the beads are important. The beads are often linked to marriage ceremonies and fertility and some really cool stuff like that. But the most interesting thing I found about learning about Australian beads, and I don't have a lot on them, is that the most important part of the necklace is the string or hair used. They actually gather up hair from family members so that you can have a piece of your family with you when you move on to the next part of your life. But it's the string that's important at least as much, if not more, than the beads. So I mentioned that trade beads were used as a currency. These cards are from the Card Museum of Contary sample cards. There's a bajillion cards out there if you're interested. These are the beads that were available for trade goods. In some areas, they would trade only specific beads for specific merchandise. So you might get a place where, for example, these dotted beads would only be traded for, say, fish. Whereas if you wanted these striped beads, you'd have to provide some other raw material. That was mostly to keep so that the natives that they were trading with on whichever continent they were trading with would be more likely to bring them a variety. Or if they had quotas to meet, they'd bring X number of beads to get X number of whatever they were trading for. And it helped them to know what they were going to have in their hold if they could only trade specific beads for specific merchandise. Single color beads are by far the most common archaeological find that is a whole find in and of itself. Archaeologists find pot shards is the single most common find is broken pieces of pottery. But if you're talking about actual whole pieces of anything, beads are the most common thing found. And single color beads are the most common, to the tune of, depending on the Viking era, up to 96% of all the beads found in specific time periods were single colored. This is a Viking necklace, and while not all of these are single colored, on the third strand down on the right hand side, there is about 8 or 10 beads over here that are multicolored. They're all in the same color family, so they were probably all manufactured in the same place, as opposed to all of the rest of the beads that has a greater variety. This was probably a child's grave. The white beads were most common in 12 to 14-year-old girls' graves. There were white beads in younger and older, but for this many, this was probably the grave of a 12 to 14-year-old girl. By the time the girls are in their 20s, they usually have much fewer beads. And when they're much younger than 12, they have much fewer beads, usually a fraction of this many beads. This was probably a very wealthy daughter who probably died between her 12th and 14th birthday before she'd actually given birth to her own daughter.
Ashley or Marjorie, we had a question. Are you pulling from the concise edition of the History of Beads? Does the full version have more on the timeline?
I am pulling from the concise history. There's 2 versions of this book. It's the History of Beads. Mine does not have a dust jacket anymore, so it's kind of boring and blue. This is the History of Beads by Lois Sher Dubin. This timeline was pulled from the 30,000 BC to the present. The one from 100,000 BC to the present has a slightly longer timeline. It takes up the same amount of space, but it covers an extra 70,000 years. There's not actually a lot of extra stuff in this from 100,000 BC to 30,000 BC.
Okay, and we also had instructions for changing your mouse pointer. If you want to try that now, it is possible to say, we'll do it for another workshop.
I think we'll do it for another workshop. I'm through all of the really tiny slides where it's going to matter.
Perfect.
Beads were not just made of glass and stone. These are things that are used modernly, and almost all of these have a historical basis and go back to our time period. On the far left, those are porcupine quills. These are not actually cut to be beads. Porcupine quills are hollow inside. When I was a little girl, my dad worked security in Alaska, and he once brushed up against a porcupine on one of his night rounds, and he came home with a double handful of porcupine quills stuck in his blue jeans. My mom and I were super excited that we got fresh porcupine quills, and my dad was a little freaked out that he got that close to a porcupine and didn't realize that he had. To turn the quills into beads, all you do is cut off the ends. About the last 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch is solid. They're barbed also, so they will absolutely stick to you without trying. The white end is the part that is closer to the skin, and the dark end is the part that's got the barb in it. You don't need to cut nearly as much off of the white end. In the top center, those are fish vertebrae, and these are like the easiest beads in the world to deal with. If you find a fish corpse in the river or along the shoreline, the vertebrae already have a hole in the center. So really all you need to do is clean the fish meat off of it and give them a good rinse in the creek or in the ocean, and you've got something that's ready to string. On the top right, those are cedar juniper seeds. They're also called Navajo ghost beads, and they're also used in Native American bead art.
If somebody is fascinated by the meaning behind the white beads, what resource would be good for them to dive into? that topic?
I would have to look that one up. I have an article that is on the anthropology of white beads in Viking graves. And I'd have to look up which book I got that out of, because it was one article in a journal. But it talked
To add
about.
that to the comments later.
I will try and look that up, and I'll add it to the comments as soon as I'm able to locate that
afterwards. Yeah, not right now. Also, Ashley comments that fish vertebrae are listed as paternoster beads.
Oh, so see, there you go. Nice medieval history there. Other beads that are super common are amber beads. Modernly, a lot of these are made out of acrylic and plastic. The easiest way to tell if what you have is actual amber or if it's plastic is if you heat up a needle or a pin and you push it inside the hole. If it starts to smell like Christmas trees, then that's real amber. If it smells like burning plastic, well, guess what? You've got plastic. Metal coil beads are on the top right. This particular photo is from early 20th century Ethiopian copper coil beads. But these were commonly used by the Vikings, particularly the Finns. They did a bunch of fun embroidery with their fringes with the coils. One of the nice things about the metal coil beads is they're super easy to make at home, and they're relatively inexpensive if you want to go buy them. I mentioned hagstones earlier on the bottom left. These are some modern examples. Again, just the water action. If you go by any large body of water, you can find these. Again, it depends on where you're at, what kind you're going to find, whatever rocks are native to the beach. If you're on a sand beach, you won't find as many of these, but if you're on a gravel beach, especially one that has sandstone deposits in some other harder rock, you'll find a lot of these. Cowrie shells are one of those things that everybody thought these were cool. The Vikings used cowrie shells. Even before the Vikings, some of the inland groups would use cowrie shells as a currency. Modernly, you can buy these either pierced with 1 or 2 holes, or where the back is cut away so that you can actually just string through the little teeth groove there. And get yourself like a shell necklace. These are the eye beads I was talking about earlier. The one on the right is what is the Warring States bead. It's about 1 inch tall, and it has all of those really awesome dots that are precisely placed. This is something that's incredibly out of my skill level, but I hope to one day attain the ability to make something this freaking awesome. The one on the left actually shows up in newspapers pretty regularly. It's in the Corning Museum of Glass. It's a European eye bead. I've used this as the basis for pattern for what I call knobbly beads, because with all of the little knobblies sticking out, they're fun to play with. They're very tactile. The one on the left is European, the one on the right is Chinese. So yeah, there's a level of complexity there that's just pretty amazing. For the stripes and squiggles, the ones on the left are usually just a coil or individual stripes that have been raked. You can see the far left bead had a real sharp rake, and the one in the middle on the top there had real lightly raked. This was probably done by using a serrated edge. And in fact, you can see to some degree that top center bead still has little grooves where the glass was dragged forward or dragged in an upward direction. And then the one on the right kind of splits the difference between the two. The one on the far right, that's a single picture by itself. Those are just stripes. They're just wound around the bead, just 2 colors of glass. That green base color there is what they would have had for uncolored glass. Crystal clear, transparent glass didn't happen until 1600, 1650. It's right at the end of the SCA period. Most clear glass, most transparent glass prior to that had a green hue in varying shades, but that green comes from iron deposits in the sand. So like Coke bottle green is pretty much the lightest, clearest glass that they would have been able to produce in most of our period. They could add other things to it to make different colors, but uh, this would have been pretty much clear glass. This is my absolute favorite infographic ever. So what's a bead worth? This one is based on there is archaeological record of somebody trading 1 dinar for 1 green glass bead. So I'm going to put out there that green beads were the most valuable of the single color beads. But you could absolutely, because we have that documentation that 1 dinar was worth 1 green bead, we also know that for 3 green beads, you could buy a pig, or for 5, you could buy a sheep. Cows are a little pricey, but wow, horses are freaking expensive. But yeah, this is my absolute favorite infographic, and I've got this saved all sorts of places. This one was actually created by Pole Glass Shop. That's what they're called on Facebook. If you want to go look them up, they've got some fun stuff out there, but this is by far the coolest.
But what if the guy who traded the bead for the coin was a great con man?
Well, what I'm thinking is my personal bead collection is worth several horses, so I'm practically rich. When we start talking about anthropology,
by the way, where did you find that infographic when somebody was saying, I've been looking for that? Where did you find it?
So I found it on Facebook. If you search Pole Glass Shop, and that's Pole with a capital P and a capital L, it will come up in their posted photos. It's absolutely fabulous. But if you want to screenshot this off the YouTube video, or if you tag me after this, I will be happy to send you a copy. When we're talking about what does a bead mean, this is modern, and that's a fence post, not a grave, just for the record. This is Beads of Courage is a modern 501c organization. Basically, what they do is they hook up chronically ill children with a way to tell their story. This particular strand of beads belongs to a boy named Cohen. He's a cancer survivor, and he got an organ transplant. All of the beads on here mean something. I haven't listed what every color means, but I want you to just look at all the yellow beads. Cohen got 1 yellow bead for every day that he stayed in the hospital. Every day he stayed in the hospital, he got a yellow bead to add to his strand. Every red bead on there, that's a blood transfusion. There's some fish on there. If you look super close, I think I found 4. And every fish on there is a care flight, either by airplane or helicopter, when he got transferred from the hospital he was admitted to the hospital he was treated at. Lampwork beads in the Beads of Courage program are super extra special beads. These are usually reserved for surviving a transplant, having a surgery, any super invasive test that's going to really put a kid under the weather. But there are absolutely beads on this strand that represent the blood draws, the chemo, the research studies, dressing changes, ICU graduations, and I had the most difficult time with the fact that there's not 1 or 2, but several beads on here that represent 100 days in the hospital, and looking at the number of yellows, that's not actually too hard to believe. But this is a modern use of beads, and it's one that most people don't even know about, even though it's widely represented throughout both the United States, and there's some overseas as well. They're working on getting a European chapter started. So what are your beads and what do they mean to you? In the SCA, some of those are easy. You can add site tokens, or if you get in a bead as a thank you, those are all have a story. It's awesome to have a story to go with your beads, especially if you get them one at a time as opposed to buying a full strand. So this is my selected bibliography. That top one is where I got the infographic, Pole Glass Shop. If you're interested in Viking beads specifically, Dart Company Canada, they've been working on doing recreation of Viking beads. CMOG.org is the Corning Museum of Glass. That's in New York, I believe. And they are like the best place to go to for glass in the United States. They do all the kinds of glass. If you saw Blown Away on Netflix, the prize was getting to work there. Unimas is I'm going to get this right, Norwegian university. And they've got their entire collection online. Well, pretty nearly. It's fabulous to go look through their beads and stuff. The timelines are from, I mentioned this book earlier. This is 30,000 BC to the present by Lois Scherduben. And Johann Kalmar is the first guy to catalog beads. So I want to make sure I got his name in here because I use a lot of his research. Okay, does anybody else have any questions?
I am going to let this run without us doing much for a little bit because it does take like 20 to 30 seconds for it to flow from Zoom to YouTube and then a few seconds for people to type in questions.
Okay, cool. Then I've got another little thing to talk about here. So this is a bunch of different shapes. These are all made out of black glass, which I know is like not the coolest thing for photos, but these beads are all Viking shapes. Every single one of these shapes is a Viking bead, or could have been, is a reproduction. A lot of people seem to think that single color beads are boring, and I'm going to spin this one because it's a melon bead and it's really hard to see the ridges since I picked the black one. A lot of people think that single color beads are boring. They're not. You just have to look a little harder to find the cool stuff.
So looking at the one on your right, I believe that is, are you really telling me that the COVID style beads are period?
So the COVID style beads are close to period. This one here on the right end, with all the knobblies, these are called berry beads. That's what the historians are calling them. They said they look like boysenberries, which is a type of raspberry. And yes, that is a period shape. The COVID beads are a little spikier than that with the flat ends, but yes, more or less a period shape. One of the things that's pretty universal in period is polka dots. These ones are actually reproductions, I've got two of them here, of Rus beads. These are specifically reproductions of beads that were found in Latoya, I think. I'd have to go look it up now. Ladoga, something Rus, something Russian.
We do have some questions and comments rolling in. Thank you. That was a lot of great information. I have some great resources. And do you have any opinion on tumbled rough?
On tumbled what?
Tumbled rough?
So I believe you mean that, I believe you're discussing, if I'm understanding correctly, tumbled rough, you mean rough tumbled glass? Or irregular shapes? If you buy modern lampwork beads or beads made recently, they're going to be shiny and sparkly. These beads this is how they come out of the torch, and this is how they would have come out of the torch in period. They would have been all sparkly and shiny. They would have caught the light. Beads that have been buried in the ground in varying acidity of soil start to get pitted and pocked, and they get that rough look that we start to associate with extant beads. Almost all of the extant beads in my picture, they had a matte finish to them. That's from being buried for however long until they dug them up. You can reproduce that either with acids or with rock tumbling on your modern beads. My recommendation, if you want to play with it with relatively little investment, if you put glass beads into Coke, like straight up Coca-Cola, leave it there for 3 or 4 days, it will take the shine off of the beads. It's a strong enough acid, it just takes a little while.
We
They
have
won't
the
give you the deep.
follow-up phrase chip beads. Does that mean?
So chip beads are those are pretty modern. In the medieval world, and this is going to mostly apply to Viking era because I haven't actually researched this outside of the Viking era. So we're talking about 600 to about 1100. They didn't do chip beads. They may have had one irregularly shaped bead on their strand, but every time that they got a spare minute, they would work on getting that smooth. In Viking times, medieval times, historically, up until we hit the modern era, regular things, circles, spheres, pretty much all of these shapes, they're not super common outside. If you're going to find stuff, you're not going to find stuff that's perfectly geometrical. So they wanted their jewelry to be perfectly geometrical. They wanted to know that it was made, that it was something that had been forced by the hand of man. So chip beads would be like what you would take to turn into something else. They wouldn't be something that would be, you wouldn't take the time to drill a hole in an unshaped piece of stone.
Okay. Are dots on melon beads a period thing? Patricia was experimenting with this and thought it was a likely natural extension.
Yes. I don't have a lot of documentation for it, but you're going to want to go look at the Zweiloo princess. That's Zweloo. She had on her belt, I believe, 3 different styles of melon bead. They were all green melon beads, but they had different kinds of dots on them.
Okay, glass and semi-precious unshaped tumbled raw. I've never seen a period one. I'm not sure if that's a comment or asking about it. Ashley replied, I haven't seen evidence for chip beads either. Chip beads are rare in a modern affectation, rare in all time periods. Okay.
And that, again, it comes down to why would you spend all that time polishing a rock you haven't shaped?
That makes sense.
I mean, modernly, we polish them in a drum and walk away for 3 days and come back and we have a shiny. But in period, that would have been somebody either manually sanding or with a bucket or barrel rolling it until it got to the appropriate level of polish. So it's a matter of we've modernized and we can just polish chip rocks and they look really cool and we like them. But again, in period, the amount of time investment it would take to get that rock pretty, why wouldn't you shape it first?
That makes sense. And I suspect this is an entirely different topic. What can you talk about how the Vikings actually arranged their beads? Did they use specific shapes or patterns or color combinations? That really sounds like a separate workshop.
Okay, so there's a lot of anthropology in that, but there's 2 main ways that Vikings would have strung their beads. There's 3. Most people believe, most of the experts I've spoken to, folks from Europe and folks who have had firsthand knowledge, either they would have been strung on wax linen thread or a leather thong. Those are the 2 most common, or they would have been strung on metal. I'm going to stand up here so you can see my necklace. This is a reproduction of a Norwegian find, and glass was more expensive than silver. And I don't know if you can see it on here, but each bead has 2 lengths of silver wire going through it, so that if any of the wire breaks, which is the most likely thing to wear out on this chain, then this will just hang down straight, so you won't actually lose the glass. You only lose the wire ring. This one's Norwegian. There's also another one where they've got a bead suspended inside of each circle. As far as colors, it's going to depend on where you're at. So for example, the British Isles, there's a lot more black beads than there are on the European continent. In Germany, green glass was pretty common. It was not super common, but it was relatively common. For the roofs and a lot of the Scandinavian countries, green was the rarest color. It was the hardest to find. Sometimes there will be pockets where a single color bead is like a bright red will suddenly be super popular in this one village, and then the surrounding villages will have like 2 or 3 beads each in this same bright color red. And it's 2 possible reasons that I can come up with for that happening. One is somebody had a red glass and they broke it and they gave it to the bead maker and he turned it into beads. Or somebody had actually traded for a stick of red. Glass was traded in both chunks and rods in period, in addition to finished items. And for lampwork beads, so making glass and making things out of glass were at least 2 different industries. Glass making was primarily something that was done around the Mediterranean. It was done elsewhere too, but even now around the Mediterranean is where most of the glass comes from. But then it was colored or shipped or turned into stuff. There's still a lot of people, I mean, look at Venice, that do glass on the Mediterranean basin. It's a tradition there. And that tradition goes back centuries, even into our period. But lampworking, it can be done relatively mobile. It's a multi-day process to set up a glass bead furnace. But if you don't have to melt the glass, you don't have to make the glass. If you're just melting the glass, maybe a week to set up the furnace so you can start working on it. The biggest difference between what I do, I'm a lamp worker, and what they did in period is I have a steady fire. I use a torch. And because I have a steady fire and I don't have to spend hours building the fire to get it up hot enough to melt glass, I can sit down and do 10, 20, 50, 70 beads in a day, as opposed to on a period furnace, you're going to spend 4 hours building up the flame. You need to get the fire above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
Isn't that what peons are for?
So wood burns at 450-ish degrees Fahrenheit. So there's a lot of extra stuff you've got to do to the wood. You've got to add air. It's a bunch of stuff to get it hot enough to melt glass. I don't have to do all that. I get to skip that and go straight to the melting the glass. So I get way more practice in than a lot of people had. But it also explains why apprenticeships are so long. And dude, I don't want to be running the bellows all day.
So I was right. It was all about the peons.
Yeah. All right. Do we have any other questions?
No, just the comment, some beads were sand polished in the Egyptian era in India today, which is more of a comment, going back to our sanding thing. So it sounds like we are drawing to a close unless something pops up in the next few seconds, but we've been talking long enough that I suspect if there were more questions, we'd have seen them. So thank you so much. That was really informative, and I might try and talk you into coming back another time for a more intensive, here's how the Viking strands looked type workshop.
Well, and that's not uniform, and a lot of the beads that they found in the grave finds are loose. So at that point, we're just guessing. Because we don't know if they were actually loose and not strung, or if they were strung and the string's no longer there. There is some evidence that people carried around beads that were not strung. I read an article and I really wish I could find it again because I read it like 3 times and I'm like, oh, that's going to be easy to find. And I went looking for it last week for this class and I could not find it. There was a Viking grave where they found a half a bead, which is not uncommon. If it's not annealed properly, they'll break straight down the middle. It's relatively common, but this was a super decorated Viking bead and they found it in a grave. And they noted it, and it was like 4 years before they got back in the area to continue digging. And in another grave in that area, they found the other half. But the first bead that they found was just half a bead. It was relatively new when it was buried, and it just looked like half a bead. The second half that they found, all the sharp edges had worn away, It was pretty obvious it had been carried by someone for years or decades. It was all smooth. It had either been carried in a pouch or a pocket, and it was buried with the guy, just half a bead. And I was like, that is the coolest thing ever. That is a love story told in a single bead. But that does give us evidence that beads were carried and not just strung.
That is overly touching. I am here literally tearing up about that. So thank you, Lady Marjorie, for giving us this talk and sharing your expertise. This has been lovely. Your Laurel says hi. So yes, hopefully we will see more of glass making or bead making classes type thing in the future. So thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
And I'm assuming that John will